Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on Lti Advantage Basics. I just wanted to let you know before we begin that all of the participant audio lines have been muted. We are recording this session and it will be available about 24 hours after we're done today's session. If you have any questions for James, who's our speaker today, you can submit them via the Q&A panel, or you can also send them to me via the chat panel on your WebEx tool. Okay, so now we're ready to get started. James?
Thanks. So today we're going to be going through Lti Advantage from a slightly more technical angle, but covering all the Lti Advantage basics. And we'll be talking about how it's different from Lti 1.1, which a lot of people use already. So the first thing with Lti is there's some great resources, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. You may have to zoom in a little bit because sometimes WebEx is punky with larger displays. So we'll go ahead and share. So on the IMS Global site, there's a lot of documentation and a lot of discussion around the benefits of Lti Advantage. So I would encourage you guys, if you're curious after the talk, or to come here and just read through the resources. They're very good, and they describe exactly what Lti Advantage is and what the benefits are. So Lti Advantage is a big upgrade over Lti 1.1, both in the security framework and the ease of use and the improvement for the user experience, along with security, which we will talk about in depth. So Lti Advantage consists of an Lti core, which is what the 3 extensions are built around. So these 3 extensions are the name and role provisioning service. A similar service exists in Lti 1.1. It's the membership service. There's deep linking, which is a way for you to add content from a tool to a platform very easily. This also existed in a earlier state as content item in Lti 1.1, and then there's the assignment and grade services, which also existed in Lti 1.1. So for anybody that already has implemented 1.1, a lot of the concepts that we talk about here are going to be very familiar to you. The thing that we've done here as part of Lti Advantage is greatly increase the use cases and how these things are supported to make it easier. The Lti 1.1 services for these 3 things were very popular and widely used, but they didn't account for some use cases. So the use cases that are covered by these 3 services are now much greater than they were previously, and we'll see that here in a second. So another thing to mention here is that there's plenty of early adopters that are already starting to work on 1.3 or actually even getting ready for certification. So we've enlisted many of the large platforms and many tools to adopt this early so that IMS can tweak the specs and improve them so that when we make these specs public, you can be confident that people have already implemented it, and a lot of the small kinks that usually happen are worked out at that point. There's also, if you click here in the Lti Advantage enables better user experiences link, there's also a very nice document that describes why it's better and how it helps the end user. So what I'm going to show you and where we're going to work out most of our time through this the next 30 minutes is actually with a tool that IMS has built. So for the first time ever, we actually built at IMS our own reference implementation for Lti. So it contains a tool and a platform. That way, as you're developing one side or the other, depending on what type of services you offer, you actually have a place to develop against and test against. The reason that this is beneficial because in the past, if you were adopting or implementing Lti, you would, in many cases, have to do both sides, or at least some part of both sides, because in this particular case, in 1.3, since you don't have a platform or a tool to test with, in order to verify that your stuff works, you would have to build part of the other side. So what we've built here, and I'm going to switch my screen over, is this is the IMS Lti Advantage Reference Implementation. What we've noticed so far from member feedback is that this has cut down the time to implement LTI dramatically, because you have a known good tool or platform that you can develop against. So let's talk for a second about how the security has changed in Lti Advantage versus Lti 1.1. So Lti 1.0 and 1.1 were based on Oauth 1, which is this principle that both sides have a key and secret, and you're signing the request as it comes across the wire. And as long as the other side has the same key and secret that the originator had, then they can unsign it, verify that the request was indeed sent from the person they received it from, and everything was good to go at that point. The fact of the matter, though, is that Oauth 1 has actually been deprecated officially by that working group for quite some time now. So Lti 1.3, or Lti Advantage, was a great way to upgrade the security model here. So what we've done is upgraded Lti to Oauth 2, which is generally regarded as a more secure way of handling these type of requests, along with implementing parts of OpenID, which is a very popular spec for authentication that already exists. So if what most members are saying is that they've implemented Oauth 2 or parts of OpenID already in other parts of their apps, so this is very familiar to them. And Oauth 2 and OpenID is very prevalent, so no matter which programming language you're using, you're guaranteed to find libraries that are updated and exist for these technologies. So the Oauth 2 is, through the Oauth 2 flow, you are still signing the request, and the tool is expected to verify the signature. One of the primary differences, though, is that in Lti 1.0 and 1.1, both sides had a shared key and secret. So what this means at the end of the day is that anybody else that had the key and secret could emulate both sides. So if I somehow got the key and secret that's being shared between the tool and platform, I could send requests both ways, and it was impossible to know that the request wasn't from the person you thought it was, because I had the key and secret. And Lti 1.3 or Lti Advantage, the fundamental key and secret have changed, so it's all based around public and private keys. So as we'll see here as we go through this, the platform has an independent public key and private key, and the tool has an independent public key and private key. So what this means is if somebody was to get one side's public and private keys, they could only emulate that side. They couldn't emulate both sides. So that's a huge improvement alone. So inside the Lti reference implementation here, many members have already used this, and what we can see is if you are a platform or a tool consumer in Lti 1.1 language, you might set up a tool in here. That way, as you are implementing inside your platform, you would have a place to launch out to. And as you'll see here in a few minutes, the reference implementation is very closely aligned with the certification suite. So the reference implementation will offer you helpful feedback to say, hey, everything looks good, or here's a few things that you're not sending correctly that you need to fix. So not only was the idea here with the reference implementation to make it easier to actually implement the specs, but also make it easier to certify, because if you fix the things that the reference implementation will suggest that you fix, doing certification should be a breeze. In fact, we've seen a few people do it in like 6 or 7 minutes, which is a huge improvement over the previous certification suite. And I should say, as part of Lti Advantage, we've also completely redone the certification suite. So I won't be showing this today. Maybe we'll show it next time, but it's 10 times easier to use than it was previously. So I don't think certification will be as much of a burden. And in fact, we're encouraging people to use the certification suite on a regular basis to validate that code changes that you might have made or new releases that you might have released are actually still compliant with Lti 1.3. Where previously certification was a bit of a pain, so doing it once a year was about as much as most people wanted to do it. We're finding that some people now are actually running through certification more frequently. So that being said, we can see here also that there are platforms that people have set up. So if you're a tool provider or what's known in 1.3 just a tool, what you might set up inside the reference implementation is a platform, and this platform has the ability to launch out to your tool. So you're guaranteed to get a request that's 1.3 or Lti Advantage compliant that's implemented directly from the spec. So we've entered kind of a quandary here actually, because for the first time ever also we actually have some tools that are certifying ahead of platforms being ready, which is really, really good, because a lot of the tools have been instrumental in how the spec is developed and how it's implemented. And over this period of time that they've been developing against this, several tools have found issues that have been resolved. So it's been good for the spec, and I think what the end result is going to be is that the spec is less Jello-ish when you go to implement it. You can know that people have already done it ahead of you. That way you can save time that way. So for anybody that hasn't seen a public key and a private key, the reference implementation will generate those for you. When you use these in your production environments, you should certainly generate these yourselves. But for the purpose of demonstration, this is very similar to what existed in 1.1 as the key and secret, except now it's a public key and a private key. One thing else I should mention here too, while we're talking about the high-level stuff, is we are very dedicated to keeping the release notes up to date for the reference implementation, because as the spec evolves and things change, sometimes there may be we may introduce a breaking change because of a bug fix or a security update or whatnot. So if you end up using this tool to develop against, I encourage everybody to just check out the release notes every now and then. And of course, if something's not working the way you think it should, feel free to reach out to us. So taking a look at the platform, just looking at what needs to be configured for one. I'm going to use mine just because I know it's good. In a platform, a tool has to register a few values. In this case, we're looking at the platform setup, and you'll see it's a little bit different than Lti 1.1. There's an Oauth 2 client ID. This is a shared value between the tool and the platform. So when the tool needs to make requests like the names and roles service to get the roster or submit a grade back, this Oauth 2 client ID is instrumental for that. The tool for the deep linking service can expose an endpoint where deep link launches should be initiated from. And since the tool has its own public and private key, and the platform has its own public and private key, the private key is always kept secret, so you should never share that with anybody. That is your secret, and that is what guarantees that the requests coming from your tool or platform are actually coming from your platform. And we'll take a look at this in a second, but the platform also needs to know the tool's public key. So this public key is like an LTI1 key, And you can see it looks very much like the thing that we were just looking at when we generated them. Because the tool is going to send some service calls back to the platform, this public key is what enables the platform to identify the tool. So in the next session, we'll talk a little bit more in detail about these things and how they work. So if we look at the tool setup real quick, you'll see that it's very similar. The tool has the same client ID. This is for OAuth 2. This is the tool's private key, so this is the thing that the tool should never share, but it's also what the tool is going to use to sign its request back to the platform. We're not going to talk too much about deployments here in this session, but in Lti 1.3, the paradigm has shifted a little bit. What we realized from years of experience with Lti 1.1 is sometimes tools have a need to have multiple versions of their tool inside the same platform. It could be for very practical reasons, like perhaps you have a student pay model for one department and you have an institution pay model for another department. How you would have solved this in 1.1 typically is to use something like custom parameters, and that becomes a little bit messy. And as time changes, it's hard to maintain those links. So in the next session, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but in Lti Advantage, each tool can actually have multiple deployments inside the platform. So if an English department, for example, was student pay model where the student's responsible for buying their own books, they might have an integration with deployment ID of 123. And if you had an integration with another department at the same school, and it was institution pay, meaning just the materials came right out of the student's institution, you might have a separate deployment of 456. The thing to note about these deployments is they share the same credentials. You don't have to have an independent key and secret for each deployment of your tool. The only thing that really changes is this deployment ID. So the business logic related around this deployment is contained in the tool, really. So it would vary depending on how you set up your systems, but you would see either 123 or 456, and then you could accordingly adjust what you're doing with the UX. So the platform will share a well-known key endpoint. So if we go look at this real quick, since the key and secret is different between the tool and platform, what's going to happen in Lti Advantage is the platform will find the request with its private key, launch out to the tool, and in order to verify the signature, the tool has to know the platform's public key. And the platform actually exposes an API for that. The next session we'll actually talk more about this, but it's kind of an important concept to understand. So the benefit of having this URL, if you're thinking, wow, like why wouldn't I just store that on the tool side, is in Lti 1.0 and 1.1, it was very hard to rotate keys and secrets. So oftentimes what happened was a tool and a platform would have the same key and secret for many, many years. So if for whatever reason your key and secret were compromised, it was very difficult and time consuming to change that because you had to coordinate that between both sides. So with this public key and private key, you can actually rotate your keys anytime that you want. And because the tool is reaching back out to this URL to fetch the public key, this is what enables the platform to switch it whenever they want. And vice versa, the tool has the option to stand up a URL like this too, where if their system was compromised or you just wanted to rotate your public and private key on a regular basis, you could, and it wouldn't break the integration. So that's a very positive security improvement also. So, and then there's also an OAuth 2 URL that the tool will receive from the platform. When you want to submit a grade or fetch the roster, you need an OAuth 2 access token, and this is the URL that you get that from. We will actually look and see what this looks like right now. So the next section, we'll talk more about what these things mean and how it affects integrations. But for now, let's actually take a look at an Lti Advantage launch. That way we can start seeing how similar it looks, but how different it is at the same time. So I'm going to find my platform. In here, you can see that the platform has courses, resource links, line items, and results, what pretty much most platforms have. The first thing we'll do is go to a particular resource link. This is simulating a link in the LMS that the student or instructor would click on to get out to the tool. So if we do this, we're going to start to see one of the minor differences, but it's also a great improvement. And I'll link this in the chat. But in LTI 1, the message that was being sent from the platform to the tool was a very large post form, essentially. So you would receive many, many attributes inside this, and they weren't structured or organized very much. So when the platform launches out to the tool is going to get things like user ID, context ID, context label, context title. The things that you're all using today and expect to be there are still there in 1.3 or Lti Advantage. It's just organized slightly different. And the way that it's organized is that you receive one attribute from the platform. It's a value. It's a ID underscore token, and the value of this token is actually the LTI attributes that you're used to expecting, but the value of the token is actually what's signed. So this is a slight difference in LTI 1.3. So let me put this in the chat real quick. If you've never heard of Json Web Tokens, this website here is the official website for it, but they also do the best at explaining what it is and how it's used. So let me just find the chat button real quick. So going back here, the reference implementation has stopped the request before it's actually sent to the tool. We haven't done that yet. But what you're going to see here is a JOT. And going along with Oauth 2, inside this JOT is several claims. It's just JSON. So for context ID, context label, and context title, which you'd be used to receiving, it's now wrapped inside this context claim. And you still have the context ID, context label, and context title. Not a lot has changed there. And if you're using LTI 1.1, you would have type here. So essentially what has changed here is not the data that's being sent. It's just organized in a slightly better and improved way. And what most people have said, and what I found out for myself, was it's actually way easier to parse this because everything is organized. So if you're used to getting a plethora of custom attributes that might be mingled in with all the rest of the data, it's actually inside of its own claim now. So anything that's custom or not, part of the normal attributes that you would receive would be inside this custom claim. That way, when you receive this request and you go to parse it, you would know that. You wouldn't have to look at all these other attributes. So one thing that's worth mentioning here, because it actually happened in real life, which was actually kind of funny, and it was almost like they won the lottery. We're using a random name generator here because we don't store PII inside the reference implementation. So the first and last name here are completely random generated. So in the 1 in a million chance that you happen to get somebody that looks familiar to you, it's actually not at all. So if I refresh this, we can see it completely generated new values. So the all the things that you are expecting from an LTI 1.1 request are actually in here. So here's a roles claim, and this is just a container for organizing the actual roles. Here's the resource link values. So the resource link ID, resource link title, and resource link description are still right here. And the actual values of these are no different than 1.1. So we can see that there's some tool platform attributes also. Again, the values haven't changed. As members uncover new use cases or ways that the spec isn't exactly working for them, we've offered a option in 1.3 to allow for extensions, which are sort of like plugins. So what we're seeing here is a claim that's generated by the LTI assignments and grades extension. For use cases that are outside of the spec, instead of having to implement something custom, what we're hoping and encouraging here is that people actually implement these in a standard way and suggest extensions back to IMS. We have 4 or 5 extensions already that are being worked on by various members. So instead of having a custom integration, if new extensions are added or you create some of your own, they're just new claims inside of the LTI request here. So just like this is a assignments and grades extension claim, this is the same thing here, but it's for the names and role service. And in fact, here's another extension for Caliper that the Caliper group invented, where they wanted to extend Lti Advantage to work with Caliper, and all they did was write a new extension. It becomes a new claim inside of the launch, and that's all there is to it. So I'm going to go ahead and perform the launch. What we'll see before we go, though, is this JOT right here, this Json Web Token. If we scroll all the way over, you're going to see it's a very long value. This is the signed version of what we're looking at up here. So the platform or the tool, depending on who's sending the request, has built this token, inserted the values that they want to be there, and then they sign it very much like LTI 1.1, except it's using the public key and the private key. So we're going to perform the launch now. And since we only have 3 minutes and we have a next section, we're going to stop here. But what we've seen at this point is that the reference implementation tool has received the request from the reference implementation platform. As I was saying, we want this to be very closely aligned with certification. So the reference implementation tool actually validates the request that you sent. We can see here that there's 0 errors and 0 warnings, which means per certification we're doing everything correctly. And the next session we'll actually start talking about the 3 extensions. But just as a teaser, if we wanted to, we could submit a score back to the platform, which we just did. So in the background, since we don't have an assessment built into the reference implementation, we've sent a random value. And this is the response that the platform gave back to us, which is that it recorded the result and what the score was and who it was for. So with that, I'm going to stop and see if anybody has questions. But if not, I would encourage you guys to attend the next session where we'll talk more in detail about these.
And the next session that James referred to is on October 31st, so next week at the same time. And you can get to the registration for that at imsglobal.org/events. James, there is one question about the differences between the LTI Advantage extensions and OneRoster. Could you help understand when a tool provider might choose one over the other?
Yeah, so OneRoster is more about getting data from one place to the other or having a shared set of data from both sides. LTI doesn't deal with that as much. LTI is more about securely getting the user from the platform to the tool and less about sharing data. So LTI is more along the lines of the transport mechanism, where OneRoster is more along the lines of both sides understand that a course and a section are this, and the students exist inside those. So we can touch on that a little bit more next time. the same data that's used in one roster, if say a platform has integrated with one roster, might be used in the LTI launch. And next time we'll take a look at that and just kind of unravel how the both specs work together.
James, another question about should we be using LTI Advantage or LTI 2.0?
Good question. So LTI 2.0 hasn't been officially deprecated yet, but it's heading in that direction. So do not use LTI 2.0. It's a lot of the great things about LTI 2.0 have made their way into LTI 1.3. Unfortunately, the adoption level for 2.0 is nowhere near where it needed to be. So 1.3 is the way to go.
And you can link to more information about the LTI roadmap from the LTI page on the IMS Global website, which details the move to 1.3 and the new security model. So that should help. And there's, we think, a helpful FAQ out there that will provide more detail around that. Another question, James, are there any best practices on modifying the consumer profiles to support both LTI 1.1 with Oauth 1 and LTI 1.3 with Oauth 2?
So that's a great question too, and we'll talk about that more in the next session.
Okay, and then finally, there's a question about, is there time to briefly discuss how Caliper added the extension from both sides?
Yeah, so that's a good question also, and we'll talk about that more in the next session. In fact, if we have time, we can actually look at this and understand what the Caliper extension is doing and what the end result is. It's very, very cool.
Okay, and then just a reminder that if you can't make that next session on October 31st, that will also be recorded and made available from the IMS website. Okay, and there actually is one more question, James. Is documentation on LTI only available to members of IMS Global?
It is right now. We actually have an implementation guide and a developer's guide that we'll be releasing. So when the spec goes public, it'll be available to the general public, but for right now, it's only available to members.
Okay. Wonderful. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And again, that next session is on October 31st. If you're able to join us, please do. And thanks and have a great day. Thanks, James.
Thank you, everybody.